So Waleed, I'd like to talk to you about the different Islams from around the world,
Mm.
and I'd like to talk to you also about the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, which, as we know, is quite centered as well in North Africa, which is much more than just Arabs.
Yeah.
So it's an Arab Spring. I suppose that's an easy thing for it's something that's caught on. It's easy for people to say. Um, so, can you please give us an indication of uh, the kinds of trends that are sweeping through the world of Islam now and throughout the different parts of the world where different parts of Islam reside?
Well, it's a huge world and a hugely diverse world, and that's a really important point that I actually find as I travel around the Muslim world. A lot of people in the Muslim world don't appreciate because,
Right.
I mean, for example, I've been to Egypt, which is where my family's from, and you get in the taxi, and when they hear that I'm from Australia, firstly they're very confused, and then secondly it's clear that they've found it hard to imagine Muslims who are not Arabs who don't speak Arabic.
Right.
And you mentioned to them that, well, there's this country called Indonesia. I don't know if you've heard of it, but they have lots of Muslims there, like 250 million of them. So you can see within the Muslim world, actually, even there's not much of an appreciation of just how diverse the Muslim world is.
Right.
But in a country like Australia, you get to see it
Mm.
because there are 400,000 Muslims in Australia or something like that.
Mhm.
And they come from 70 different countries
Mm.
or more.
Mm.
They speak so many different languages, and they bring with them different traditions of Islam.
Mm.
So, I think broadly speaking, you could probably point to three really broad kinds of Islam.
Okay.
One is a fairly folkish Islam that is more to do with culture.
Right.
And yes, there's Islamic practice,
Right.
but that practice is something that is really received from parent to child and
Right.
handed down the generations.
So it's a kind of localized expression of Islam.
Yeah, and it often will reflect the specific cultural histories of whatever country you're in. So to go back to
Okay.
Indonesia,
Right.
you have a very long Hindu history
Right.
in Indonesia.
Right.
And so you will find times where Islamic practice has kind of been a little bit mingled with Hindu practice,
Yes.
and at different levels. Like some have a lot more Hindu kinds of practice in them than others, which are much more inherently Islamic. And you get this kind of mix that's going on. And you can see that actually right throughout the region.
Yes, including Malaysia.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so in Malaysia it's interesting because, of course, you've got a Malay culture,
Yes.
and Islam is synonymous with that. But so much of Malay culture would be completely alien to a Muslim who's living in the Gulf or in the
Right.
Middle East. And so
Right.
what a lot of Malays might think of as inherently Islamic,
Mm.
other Muslims around the world wouldn't necessarily recognise as being Islamic because
Right.
of those cultural inheritances. And so I think a lot of Muslims don't understand necessarily what is part of culture and what comes from culture
Mm.
and what is inherently religious, right? As
Right.
in a textual sort of
Sure.
scriptural sense. right?
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
there's a context and there's a text, and it looks
Exactly.
like there's a very mixed up interpretation of the text with the context.
Yes, and well, I'd go further than that and say the thing about Islam and traditional Islam, like, the Islam of traditional scholars, is that actually text and context are always in a conversation.
Mm.
So there is no text
Mm.
without context. You can't understand the Quran. In fact, you can't interpret it. One of the methods that you must use in interpreting the Quran
Right.
is to understand the historical context in which each verse was revealed.
Right. How orthodox is that view that you are espousing?
Deeply orthodox. It's been around for 1400 years.
Okay.
It's not that that doesn't say that the Quran is not immutable or that the Quran is not eternally relevant.
Mm.
But in order to understand what it means,
Mm.
you need to understand each verse in its historical context. It's in the science of tafsir, or explaining the Quran.
Sure.
It's called identifying the sabab an-nuzul, the occasion of revelation.
Okay.
What was the episode in history?
Right.
What was happening in, say, Medina at that time
Right.
before that verse arrived.
Okay.
And how does that influence the way that verse can be interpreted?
Right.
And this is very important, for example, when you start to look at verses concerning warfare.
Mm.
If you take a verse in isolation, not just in isolation from other verses, but in isolation from the particular historical context of it, you can reach conclusions that are just are absurd.
Right.
And this is what happens.
Okay.
So text and context are always implicit in one another. You can't interpret the text without context. And in fact, within classical Islamic law, there's this concept of urf, or custom.
Okay.
That Islamic doctrines must necessarily be interpreted in the light of local customs. Local customs actually give meaning and context and content to general principles of Islamic law.
All right. 2 questions. Why is it that there seems to be an extreme harking back to the context of the Prophet, for one? And so the context of the present is almost obliterated. And so the Quran is only interpreted in the context of the time of the Prophet. It's harking back to a golden age.
Yeah.
And it ignores then, the evolution and changes in customs. Why do you think that is so?
I think part of that is because of a misunderstanding, not of Islamic law, but of Islamic jurisprudence. And there's a difference here.
Okay.
Islamic law often is used to mean the rules.
Yep.
Islamic jurisprudence is not the rules.
Right.
It's how you derive those rules.
Right.
And I think what's happened, unfortunately, in a lot of Muslim communities, is that people have stopped being taught and stopped talking about jurisprudence. They've stopped understanding how you go from texts to conclusions.
Okay.
And that, I think, is a problem.
Okay.
Because that's what leads people, I think, either to do one of 2 things. One, jump straight from text to an answer that is not very well reasoned. Or to take a fatwa from a medieval scholar who's talking in a completely different time.
Right.
And apply it to another situation which is a completely different situation.
Okay.
So in Australia, for example, we had this controversy around the issue of Christmas.
Right.
People would use a fatwa from, I think, the 13th century.
Okay.
Which said that Muslims should not say Merry Christmas.
Oh my goodness, it happens in Australia too. Okay.
Yeah,
It happened here a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And there was a fatwa, I think, or a directive from a government agency. But
yeah. And so what they're doing is they're basing it on a 13th century fatwa that made a whole lot of assumptions about society that were about that society and what it means.
Right.
If you say Merry Christmas to someone in that society, in a society where identity was so defined by religion and religious doctrine,
that's right.
Then to say Merry Christmas could easily have been seen as accepting the doctrines on which it's based.
Sure.
And so you have scholars of that time saying, well, don't say Merry Christmas because that is an acknowledgement and an acceptance of Jesus as divine.
Right.
Now, you can have all sorts of arguments about whether or not that's actually what it means, but you can at least see that argument.
Yes.
But if you take that and then you look at Australia in the 21st century, where Christmas has actually become less and less Christian, and is really now getting to the point of being a cultural festival.
Right.
Nobody in Australia, if they hear a Muslim say Merry Christmas, is going to hear that and say, I didn't realise you believed that Jesus was divine. You simply would never reach that conclusion. Now, that may not be the case in Malaysia, I don't know. Each context is different. So I'm not commenting on the Malaysian case because it's a completely different context.
Understood.
But the point is those contexts are different, and so the answers should be different. And so I think you get mistakes and silly things being said when people don't understand the importance of the social context in which they're operating. And this is not some modern liberal quasi-secular idea. people as respected and traditional as Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who's one of the most esteemed jurists in the Hanbali madhab. The Hanbali madhab is the school of thought that's very prominent in the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, for example.
Right.
So a fairly conservative school of thought. He was saying in a book called I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, he said that great hardship and misunderstanding of the Sharia has come about because people don't understand that fatwa or fatwas are limited in time and space.
That's very interesting.
Right. My point is, all traditional scholars understand this. They all understand that context is really important. That's why one of the things that was essential in someone giving you a fatwa was that they knew you and they knew your time and they knew your social circumstance.
Okay.
And that started to break down, unfortunately, for a lot of Muslims, partly because there are not as many scholars around as there used to be, but also because now people will consult Sheikh Google, and type in their question and get an answer from someone in a totally different part of the world who's never met them, doesn't know anything, and is probably answering someone else's question.
Right.